Hello, Social 20, and welcome back. So when we were finishing discussing the end of World War One, we looked at the Treaty of Versailles, and we looked at some of the conditions that were happening in Europe at the time and how aggrieved Germany was. And so what we're going to look at today is how did the idea of ultranationalism, the feelings towards ultranationalism develop? So what we're really looking at is three specific countries in what is known as the interwar period. So we are finished World War I, and World War II is going to start in 1939. So it ended 1918. So it's about 20 years in there. And what we're going to look at, one of the main causes for World War II, is that there's rise of what we call ultranationalism. So we're going to be looking at Russia, Japan, and Germany in relation to how these ideas started to take rise in those individual countries. Here's our lesson objectives for today. And so what we're going to look at first is Russia. Now, you might have remembered when we looked at the alliances going into World War I that Russia was heavily involved in alliances throughout Europe and their involvement in World War I. Now, World War I ended in 1918. But in 1917, Russia had what was called a civil revolution, and they had their own sense of kind of uprising in their country that they had a large focus on, that they actually pulled out of World War I. So Russia, because of the revolution, they were going away from the concept of what we looked at when we were talking about the French Revolution under an absolute monarch. They had been ruled by monarchs without any limits on their power for hundreds of years, and now suddenly they want a different form of governance. Ironically, much like the French Revolution got rid of the absolute monarch and replaced it with Napoleon, who in some ways was a dictator himself, we see that kind of happen again in Russia, and they're moving towards the concept of communism. Communism you're going to look at in depth in grade 12, but it's really a shift away from division in society. And the idea is that everybody's meant to be equal. Of course, there's always a group in charge. It's usually under a dictator, and there's not a lot of choice in the policies that are adopted in that country. So Russia was going through a lot of their own inner turmoil, and so they left World War I mainly to focus on the issues at home. And that was really the fight between what's called the red shirts that represented communism and all the other political parties who had some different ideas of how a country should be run. They did turn towards communism, and then through a series of leaders that you're going to examine next year more in depth, they end up being ruled by this fellow called Joseph Stalin. You might have seen, here he is in this editorial cartoon here, heard about Joseph Stalin. He's a very harsh ruler, dictator who was responsible for millions of deaths. And so what started to happen under Stalin were some of the policies to try to get their country caught up, because after World War I, they were kind of behind. We had seen USA mainly stay out of World War I. They were able to work on their economy for those years, while Europe was really catching up. They had infrastructure that was destroyed. They had lost a lot of lives. And so Russia was even further behind than that. So when they were able to kind of emerge after the post-war period, they looked around and realized they were behind. They looked at USA, they looked at the production in Europe, and they realized they had to do something drastic. And so what Stalin ultimately was going to do was turn them into this kind of industrialized nation who's going to be able to compete with these other nations. And he did it through very brutal means. He took farms, he collectivized them, which means he threw families together onto one farm, took away their land, took away their animals, and they were not allowed to make crops anymore for profit. They had to give everything they made into the government, and he had very brutal means, and the government would take everything and try to sell all these crops, and he did it through these series of plans. And so one of his ideologies and one of his demands was that people were very loyal to the development and to the state and to him, and there was no dissent. Nobody could voice an opinion against him. And if you did, you would risk either being taken to a labor camp, or worse, your whole family put in jail, labor camps, or you would be killed. And so what he tried to do were these very brutal means of ruling the country, and it included a lot of forced loyalty. So you did not have a choice or an opinion to say, actually, maybe I don't like Stalin's ideas. No, that wasn't acceptable at that time. So, as we talked about, opponents of the government were either deported, they were deported often to like Siberia, where you wouldn't have any chance of survival and you wouldn't be heard from your family and your friends. You'd be jailed, you'd be executed. And of course, they were usually made to be very public. So, if there was an execution for somebody who was speaking out or trying to kind of offer an opinion away from Stalin's, it would be in public. And it sends a message, don't anybody else try this either. And so what he did was, under his plans to try to nationalize and industrialize this country, they were called his 5-year plans. Farmland was collectivized. So that meant peasant farmers, their land was seized, all of the crops that they were making for, themselves, not allowed to be consumed by them. Everything was going to go towards the government. He would take a lot of crops that were wheat and a lot of subsistence crops, and then he would replace that with something that would make more money, like sugar. And so he was kind of starving these people who were just trying to help, collectivize and work for the government. But unfortunately, a lot of people at this time, it was so extreme that if you are caught, like taking, let's say, even a little barrel of wheat and trying to make that into bread for your family, you would be brutalized. And of course, there was a sense of fear that, even amongst your own friends and family, that you did not report this to the government, or else you could be, executed or deported. This led eventually into what is called the Holodomor. Holodomor is the name for what is the genocide that occurred under Stalin. So it was a brutal man-made famine, basically. And the whole idea about it was, there was a lot of groups that had their own kind of sense of identity, and he wanted to get rid of those. And so he was really targeting a lot of the Ukrainians, wanted them to give up a lot of their farms. They were a slightly wealthier. A lot of these people were peasants, but they had a slightly higher status. And so they were not allowed to make crops anymore, as we talked about, for themselves. It was all about the cash crops. And so these people were starving. People were falling over in the streets from starvation. And the estimate is, it's hard to know, because under a communist government, there's not a lot of accurate reporting. And so the number is large. The approximate lost lives are between 2.5 to 7.5 million Ukrainians starved at this time. But it's hard to know who and what, because of the reporting, of course, and the government doesn't want to admit this. So the word Holodomor refers to the unfortunate incident in this time. This is around the 1930s, in between the war period, and this was as a result of Stalin's policies. You might ask, did he know? He knew. He didn't care. This was a very aggressive way of trying to both, get a sense of, get rid of dissent and anyone who might have any sort of opposition to his rule, get rid of minorities, and make sure that everybody's completely loyal, and that's by ruling with an iron fist. Okay, so we're going to look at another country who has a little different situation, but we're going to look at how there actually are some similarities in the rise of ultranationalism. So we're going to turn to Japan within the interwar period of 1918 to around, 1939 was the start of World War II, but we're going to look at them till 1931. So Japan actually had supported the Allies, the people who won, that would represent Britain. And so they were on the side of the Allies during World War I. This was a wise move for them, because it could increase their trade. They were an island, and part of Japan's worry about their situation was they didn't have enough goods and production that was capable to support everybody on their own. Because they're an island, they had a lot of need to trade. So they had a lot of problems with things like rice famines. The government was blamed for a lot of things that had happened. And then, because they were so dependent on trade, being an island, we had seen USA, hopefully you remember from grade 10, in the 1930s, they had the stock market crash in 1929. The next 10 years, over the 1930s, was filled with a lot of droughts and depression, and it's called the Great Depression in the 1930s. So because the USA was a big trading partner for Japan, Japan also suffered in the 1930s with nobody to trade with. and some of the time period leading up to that, and led to some famines and a sense of they had dependence on others, and others were not able to trade with them. So what they ended up doing is moving towards militarism. They actually were going to be a one-party state that was going to be controlled by the military. They were going to expand. Well, one of their large goals was expansionism. They wanted to expand what is called their sphere of influence. That's a term that you should know. And that basically meant that the countries who were kind of around them in the surrounding areas were going to have a sense of loyalty, and they were going to have an influence over these countries that were going to be geographically close to them. So they wanted to protect their interests, of course, in mainland China, Manchuria. And so they actually invaded Manchuria in 1931. And so when we look at Japan basically going into these places, trying to just kind of conquer them, and now you're going to give up your culture and whoever you are and be a part of our nation, that's like an increased sense of nationalism that we hadn't seen in the past, not in these times. So we had seen Napoleon try this kind of thing, early 1800s, going into other countries, but it had been quite a while until countries had really tried this kind of extreme form of territorial expansion. Part of not only their territorial expansion, both to try to, get more subsistence for the people on the island, they also were worried about the influence of Western ideals. They had a strong sense of kind of traditional beliefs and values, and they saw their country moving away from that. So part of implementing not only a military rule, but also this sense of a return to traditional Japan. So that meant things like Japanese superiority, values of duty, unflinching obedience to the state. So this meant strong regard for serving in the military. I'm going to serve my country and the goals thereof of my country without question. So kind of like we had seen when we were looking at Russia. Russia had very different goals. Theirs was more about competing economically. Japan also has economic concerns, which is why they're going to pursue their sphere of influence. But we also see Japan, who is interested in expansion and devotion to the state, but for slightly different reasons. So now we see Germany. So Japan was guilty of the same thing. They had gone into multiple areas trying to invade them. Now, you might think, wait a second, didn't we talk about this organization called the League of Nations that was put together as part of the Treaty of Versailles that was meant to stop a conflict and countries just going in and taking other countries? Yes, and this was one of the main failures. So when they went into Manchuria, Japan went into Manchuria, that was made aware by the League of Nations, and they did not act. So we're going to talk about that later. But yes, there was supposed to be a way to prevent these things, and we're going to see how it all broke down. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Germany in between the interwar period. So as we saw, Germany had the harshest punishment after World War I through the Treaty of Versailles. They were given the war guilt clause. They were given what was called reparations. So between those two things, they had a lot of shame, and they had a lot of money that they had to give back. And so there was unrest, there was uncertainty, there was unemployment, there was a large sense of, just general unrest in the country. And so when that happens, we see populations tend to be vulnerable to more extreme ideas. And we had, actually had a country that had had elections, and this might surprise people, but Hitler had technically come to power through a democratic means. And you're going to look at that a little bit more in grade 12. And so the Weimar Republic was in charge after World War I. No one party controlled the government. They did have different political parties. They were not a dictatorship. They did have a sense of democracy, but then we see this country emerge from war, and they've got all these problems. They've got inflation. It was called hyperinflation. So what happens was the government, they had a big bill of all their billions, and so they thought, well, I have an idea. Let's just go and print off more money. So we'll just print it. We'll print all these dollar bills, and we'll just go give them to people. Well, what happens? Simple economics. You got more supply, so more demand, less supply, and then the prices go up. And so what we saw was people needing a whole wheelbarrow of dollar bills to go and buy a loaf of bread. There's a really interesting picture in your textbook that shows a lady who's lighting, they were called the franc or the mark. So she's lighting her money on fire because it was cheaper for her to burn the money than to try to go and buy some wood to burn. And that is inflation. So prices get higher and higher and higher and higher and higher. And then you just keep printing money, and it's a really bad cycle. So if you look at this picture on the right here, she's trying to buy, it looks like a head of lettuce, and she's got a whole basket of bills. So it just becomes a really poor economy. So any economy that has really high inflation typically is not able to have a strong currency and compete in the world stage. We saw that they lost all their colonies. All of the area that they had acquired through things like the Scramble of Africa was taken away from them. They had a lot of cost of rebuilding. The war was fought on their lands as well, and so that's expensive to rebuild all the buildings and the roads and everything that got demolished. Their loan repayments through the Treaty of Versailles. And then, of course, we've seen over in the West, we've got the USA is struggling in the 1930s. They don't have as much, in terms, they're going through a Great Depression. They don't have as much to trade with people because they're trying to just focus on rebuilding themselves. And so that's reducing their trade. It's reducing their demand for goods. And so we see this horrible cycle of a very poor economic situation that's going through a lot of these countries. So in comes Hitler. So Hitler was actually under what's called the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Okay, it's called the Nazis. And so when you have an economy that is trampled, people are exhausted, and people kind of come out with these ideas. Hitler didn't come out to the people and give them all of he didn't disclose his true plans behind things, like the genocide and the Holocaust. So he had a strong sense of, I'm going to fix this economy. He was a very, very strong public speaker. If you can look up, there's like 30 seconds to 1 minute videos showing how Hitler would speak to a crowd. He had, a lot of speeches to youth and youth rallies. Look at one of those. He was a very charismatic speaker. He knew that the economy was really desperate and people were going to perhaps consider another idea. And so when we think about, well, how did this happen? You have to understand all these circumstances. So the Nazis came to power, and so the Nazis controlled all aspects of society, economically, socially, politically, military, cultural, everything. They had a sense of Germany is going to be restored. We're going to get over this. I'm going to get you jobs. We're going to, get back to our glory, basically. And he had a lot of conviction and a lot of ideas. Part of them were targeting youth and making sure that there was no dissent against him. And the problem is that nobody was really allowed to say, hey, wait a minute. Is there another way? And so when you have we see this in Japan, we see this in Russia, and now we see this in Germany. When you have a strong sense of ruling or under a dictatorship, and there's no dissent allowed, this creates a very divided society because you have fear amongst people. And you've also got, the military or the dictatorship controlling all aspects of information that people receive. And so people are worried about speaking out because they don't know who they can trust. They don't know who's going to report them. And then you've got a society in which any sort of opposition is just brutally defeated. Here to the right is the Nazi book burning. And so if you see, they are actually doing the Hitler salute there. And those would be books that would have ideas that were either not accepted under Nazi ideology or, perhaps he, of course, started his campaign against Jewish people, so they could have been written by Jews. So ultimately, so you can see this is a rally here, and these are all of the people in Germany who have come out to try to, support this new direction for their economy. And so what ultimately was behind Hitler's main ideologies were the idea of what we call the Aryan, the master race. He had this glorified vision that everybody in the world was going to have. He thought of them as superior. Blonde hair, blue eyes, German, descent, or, European heritage. And so he had a lot of very strong policies. So he wanted to eliminate anyone that was seen as inferior. So he unfortunately first started to target people with handicaps and physical disabilities, and he would eliminate them, send them off to camps, and oftentimes they would perish. And then we see him start to target groups like the Jewish people. And so he would have policies that, if you were not Jewish, you couldn't marry a Jewish person. And Jewish people were allowed to have birth control, but the other Germans were not trying to kind of promote this bloodline going of people who we saw as very pure. And we start to see the society very divided. One of the saddest legacies in the world's history. Of course, it's going to lead to the Holocaust, which we were going to be examining in the next, or actually in a few lessons. So what do we see here? We see the rise of ultranationalism amongst these three nations. We are going to look at what are some of the similarities. And so we don't see them at this point arranging and coordinating with each other. The nationalism has turned into ultranationalism, the most extreme form of nationalism, which you see yourself as ultimately superior, and your national goals are now more important than your own. And you need to understand the situation and the circumstances among the differences between these three countries, but just realize the parallels and the time, and we'll be exploring more next lesson. See you next time.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our website, online.plrd.ab.ca, and visit us on Facebook, Prairieland Online Academy. You can find out all that's going on with Prairieland Online Academy.